Oh,
I got it.
that's okay. Which is downstairs, one floor below. And Maria here is running the show. Maria is our associate director of BIOS. BIOS stands for Badger Inquiry on Sport. And we started this a couple of years ago. And it's been in the works for many years, which is, and the reason, what we try to do is bring together many people across disciplines on our campus who are examining sport in different ways. So if you go everywhere from the far west side of campus where we have the health sciences, people studying the body and everything related to sport and sport performance and health and wellness in sport. And you work your way across our great campus all the way to the far east side. We have people doing all kinds of interesting research on sport. Again, different methods, different disciplines, different theories, all kinds of different things. And so in recent weeks, we had an artist here, we've had education professors, we've had health sciences professors, we've had people in all different areas talking about sport in very different ways. And so we're excited to do that today in a new way. We're really happy to have you all here. We have a great group. And so we're just thankful to have you here looking out the beautiful sunshine after the downpour. So things are great. Today we have a special guest from University of Texas, Austin, Professor Jen McClearen, and Professor Lopez will provide the introduction.
Thank you. You did a great job. This is Jen, and she thank you, Pete, and thank you, Maria and BIOS for having us. It's really great to be here. It's been great to be a part of you guys, meet with you guys. For those who don't know me, I'm Jason Lopez. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Ars, which is over on the other side of campus that he was just talking about a moment ago. This is also a group meeting with our Media and Cultural Studies colloquium, which is represented by these tables over here, these lovely people. I guess these two too. Just to introduce Jen, a while ago, Pete and I were talking about having somebody come to BIOS that's, kind of like a preeminent scholar in sports media. And Jen came immediately to mind. Her work on the cultural difference in sport has been foundational in helping media scholars and sports media scholars understand what recent turns in which groups have been marginalized by sports media have become more visible. McClearen's book, Fighting Visibility, got that right up, yep. Sports media and female athletes in the UFC, build all this work while also correcting the fact that not enough attention has been previously paid to the UFC, which is a sport that's gaining in popularity and influence as well. Let's hear. I want to say I'm really excited for us to hear about her research and work and the study of media and sports media in particular. So I'm gonna help you all. Please help me welcome Dr. Jen McClearen.
Thank you to the Department of Communication Arts and Jason Lopez and also Pete Miller and BIOS for bringing me here. What a lovely diverse group of scholars we have in the room. We've got some kinesiology folks over here, we've got the comm arts people, and then from like different places. So that's really great. And I'm going to try to gauge my talk. There's places where it's going to be really like media studies heavy and places where I'm going to try to open it up. I think about it a little bit more broadly for you. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a little bit of overview about what I do in my research in general, because that can help set the stage for why I'm looking at the specific things that I'm looking at. And then I'm going to go into talking about a research paper that is in the publication queue right now that's about the hierarchies of visibility, which I'll define for you in a little bit. And then I'll talk about the new book project, because I actually wrote this paper that I'm going to present today as a way to kind of feel out what I want to do my next book on. So I'm going to kind of springboard into that. And this will be the very first time I get to talk about book 2. It's at the early stages, but I'm really excited about it. And it's really nice to have so many different backgrounds in the room as I'm kind of presenting that for the very first time. So thank you for that. Okay, so I want to talk about what I aim to do with my research overall. And there's 3 areas that I focus in on where I want to trouble assumptions. And when I say trouble assumptions, I'm thinking about broader cultural discourse we have about women's sports in particular. And the 3 things that I seek to do in my research are trouble the idea that representation is an end goal for social change. I want to trouble the idea what representation can actually do, and specifically out of the sports. I want to trouble this assumption, I'll do this a little bit today, that women's sports are invisible, because it's a very common discourse that you hear in both popular discourse, but then also in the sports media research. We tend to start from that assumption. And then the third thing, which I don't have time to talk about today, but I'm gonna link a QR code that has a bunch of my research in a file. And so if you're interested in trans athletes in particular, I'll talk about that. And I don't believe that trans women are a threat to women's sports. That's the preview of that research. So you're welcome to go and check out that as well. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of representation matters. So this is a very popular discourse we see across media culture. It's this idea that we believe if we can just see diverse identities in the media, then they are going to be empowered. They're going to have more agency in society. We've had this belief for a long time, and there's a lot of different work that has been done to increase visibility. But we are currently in a moment in our society where diversity and difference also sells, because we understand that lots of different niche markets want to be represented, and they are a part of this broader media system that realizes now that we don't just cater content to a straight white male 18 to 34 demographic, but actually if you cater content much more widely, you're going to get more viewerships. And so sports are a part of this as well. And there's a discourse in women's sports that we really need to increase representation in order to increase equity. There's a degree of truth in that, because it's very powerful to see yourself represented for the first time in something that you haven't been represented before. But what I argue in my research is that is very limited. And so I trouble this idea that the discourse of if she can see it, she can be it, is actually doing what we want it to as a society. And so that's what I focus in on my first book. So that I look at this idea that, yeah, okay, representation matters, but it doesn't necessarily equal equity. And the way that I do it in this book in particular is thinking about how the UFC created this, really this moment where we got to see an empowered female, or a whole lot of empowered female athletes that were making change in combat sports, being represented like they never were before. But at the same time, that representation enabled exploitative labor politics. It enabled them, the UFC, to actually exploit female athletes in the process. So is that representation actually doing any good if it's being used to then get more women into the UFC, more women into MMA, but not paying them in a way that actually is representative of the labor that they're actually doing? So for the media scholars in the room, you'll recognize some people that I have here on the screen. This is who I put my work in conversation with more broadly outside of sports media. Ideas that are critiquing this moment that we're in where difference is profitable, but asking critical questions about what does that actually do, and how can that be co-opted in ways that in some cases are superficial, and in other cases make visibility sort of the end goal without thinking about, does that actually produce equity? The other thing that I think about in my research that's relevant to what I'm talking about today is this idea that sportswomen aren't invisible. You just have to know where to look. And with that, I am talking today primarily about an article that I have coming out in JCMS, the Journal for Cinema and Media Studies. It'll come out in spring 2024. And I'm working through this idea of visibility actually existing in a hierarchical structure that parallels various levels of streaming channels, social media, all the way up to like your mainstream sports channels. And so trying to think about it a little bit differently, and then pinpointing where we are seeing women in this particular structure. And so scholarship tells us that sports are much less likely to see women's sports on things like the Sports Center, or broadcast on major sports channels, or even mainstream news media. And we know that somewhere between 4 and 10% of mainstream sports media coverage worldwide is dedicated to women. So 4 and 10%, that's not very much. And so Cheryl Cookie and Mike Messer and other colleagues have this longitudinal study where they've looked at change over time, and there's relatively little change over time. We tend to think of progress as sort of this upward mobility, but it's more like this over time is what they're finding. And if we focus just on ESPN, if we focus just on major sports outlets and primetime news, then it's not a difficult argument to make that women's sports is invisible or unimportant. The primary metric of visibility for mainstream sports media scholarship seems to be, do we see sportswomen? And within sporting mass media culture at the level that's comparable to men? And the answer is often a resounding no. But I'm wondering, is that the right question? Media scholars understand our media system more broadly as much more niche driven and diverse. And there's a plethora of platforms and avenues for you to connect with types of media that you want to be able to watch. And there's a lot of ways to monetize things that are outside the mainstream. The contemporary network sports media system, which includes intersections of broadcast medium, pay-per-view, web-based and social media and advertising, circulates a wealth of content about sportswomen in a hierarchical system of visibility, rather on one that's solely dependent on mainstream sports media ventures, who practically ignore them. Feminist sports scholars have argued that the ways that scholars think about sports tends to skew towards the mainstream as well. Susan Burrell and Diana Richer wrote in 1987, sport is a significant and pervasive cultural form whose meaning is often taken for granted because the public and scholars alike tend to recognize sport only by its highly institutional form, and I would argue its highly mediated form. Alternatives to dominant notions of sports are marginalized, trivialized, obscured, and they are not afforded the status of real sport. And so I follow alongside a lot of feminist sports media scholars like Kim Topoletti, Holly Thorpe, Tony Bruce, Cheryl Cookie, Eugenia Antonovic, who all write about feminist sports media scholarship in that we tend to focus in on things that aren't necessarily the mainstream, because that's where women are. And they're not actually invisible, they're just not in the places where we think are the most important. So, where are sportswomen? Is one of the questions that I'm seeking to answer in part of my research. And this paper in particular, I argue that in the case of women's sports, as well as less popular sports and network media, industry logics deflect who is responsible for that visibility away from networks, brands, and leagues, and onto fan communities that promote women's sports through their engagement online. The business logic and ideological process shields leagues, networks, and sponsors from the risk of investing in women's sports, and instead places the labor on those fans. So if you are in the NWSL fan community, for example, there's a lot of fervor and a lot of promotional labor that goes into promoting the sport because it's not getting picked up the same way in the mainstream. And what is interesting about that is, I think, and what I'm going to show kind of in the paper that I'm talking about today, is that has really carried the league really far and supported the league when mainstream media wasn't really paying attention to it. So a concept that I use to help explain this is the hierarchies of visibility. Network media forms hierarchies of visibility by attaching an ascending structure of monetary value to media commodities like leagues, teams, and athletes. In other words, the more perceived value, the better the real estate on our screens. This hierarchical logic measures the amount and worth of consumers those commodities attract using data analytics, audience research, and ratings to define the range of market segments into a small margin of niche consumers in global mass audiences. There's a presumed direct correlation between the visibility of a sports media commodity and its measured value. In the hierarchies, the smaller the audience, the smaller the amount of value attached, less value, and the less value the representation is. So, for example, what all of this means. If we are going to put a sports event on ABC primetime, that's kind of like high up in primetime real estate to view something. But you could also put it on ESPN. You could put it on ESPN2. You could put it on ESPN 542 because they have a zillion and one channels plus their streaming platform. Or, which in the case of the NWSL, for example, you put it on Paramount Plus. So, how many of you have Paramount Plus? So, how many of you can actually watch ESPN though? Yeah, so a little bit more. And then a lot of, Gen Z, you're watching it on all sorts of things that are not like your traditional channels anyway. Yeah. So the point is that there is this hierarchical structure in terms of like how we value content. And this also goes off or online when we think about, if an athlete gets sponsored by Nike, that is much more, there's a lot more money attached to it than if they get sponsored by Dude Wipes, which for a long time sponsored the UFC and we used to put it on the back of shorts. So it's kind of funny. But yeah, so there's a lot of levels here. And so there is a hierarchical structure for how we value women's sports, how we value other sports that are outside of the mainstream as well. So athletes, for example, become more lucrative investments when they draw attention of diverse segments of audiences, or at least quantifiable margins of audiences that are considered valuable by a given sponsor. Some key things to consider in the hierarchical structure is even the most obscure sports can have measurable value attached and can be pursued by specific brands or partnerships. So pop quiz, who is this? Obviously. Who's this? You get a lot of extra credit if you got this one. Or this. That's harder to tell because she's also covered up. This is Nico Montana. She was a UFC fighter. She was the first 125-pound champion. And she's also a Navajo woman, which I'll talk about in just a second. And this is Kiana Clay, who is an adaptive snowboarder and motocross athlete. Anybody ever heard of Kiana Clay? Probably not. If you're not into motocross or adaptive sports, probably not something that you would have heard of. So even less marketable athletes can have a dedicated fan base that appeals to specific sponsors. Fans have the power to boost the commodity's visibility within network sports media. So data drives visibility. So this is the idea that our fragmented media culture has a vast number of channels, streaming sites, and social media platforms that are all valued and monetized within a hierarchical structure that uses market research to understand consumer demographics. And it's really easy to do that type of research on social media. You can do that on anybody, it's pretty easy. And they measure followers, like shares, views on platforms. Higher rates of engagement online can translate to more monetized value. In sports sponsorships, for example, data gathered on athletes' social media engagement rates can be used by major sports brands such as Nike or niche companies like Burton Snowboards to determine who they will sponsor and how much they will pay them. So to give you an example, the UFC always runs when they have a fight week. They usually sit down with their athletes and run the data analytics on their athletes, and they tell them, you need to increase your engagement. You need to do this or you need to do that. And if you do that, we're going to put you on more marquee cards. If you're on a more marquee card, you get more exposure. You might have more opportunities for sponsorships. It's very calculated, and it's also very specific. If they're giving a card in a particular region, then they also try to connect the fighters that may be popular in that particular region. And so they're using this data. Nielsen Sports, which is a part of Nielsen ratings overall, does this type of research all the time, and they can tell us which athletes are the most are going to draw the particular types of demographics that particular sponsors may want. And so one of the ones that I was looking at that they did, they were measuring Osaka and Rose Lavelle, because Rose Lavelle, who's a soccer player for the US, she has a lot of engagement online in particular types of spaces like Instagram, where there's a lot of women on it that use the platform, and so it might be more marketable there. But athletes that have more visibility overall, like Kylian Mbappe, has much more reach in this type of structure. So I have to turn the page for the so. Who powers this visibility? So this is where I'm going to get into some specifics about, there's a lot of different ways that this gets powered. So for some examples, athletes, especially athletes in marginalized sports or women athletes, work very hard for their own visibility. And there is often payment associated with that visibility if you're visible online. And we can see that obviously with college athletes being, having NIL deals now. So there's a way to make money through this system. And of course, the leagues, the networks, the sponsors, all of that is part of the system. But what I'm looking at specifically today is thinking about fan labor and women's sports in particular. So when we think about in media studies, fan labor, we often associate it with fan fiction or other things that can get co-opted by corporate interests that fans do for free, or for very low revenue. What I'm looking at here is more specifically thinking about fan promotional labor in sports where we have a lot of avid fans, but not a lot of visibility. And they attempt to make up for that by creating Twitter feeds and blogs and podcasts and a lot of different things, because it becomes this social justice cause to raise the visibility of athletes. And so the examples of Osaka, Montano, and Clay demonstrate that each athlete can generate measurable level of revenue stream for the platforms and sponsors that feature them. So to go back and give you a couple more examples, if you think about Osaka as the top of the hierarchy, she plays tennis, which is a very lucrative sport. It's a sport that happens to pay men and women equally in terms of prize winnings. So right there, that gives her a certain level of advantage in terms of sponsorship and in terms of visibility. She's the highest paid female athlete ever. And it makes sense because it's tennis. It makes sense because tennis also has luxury sponsor brands like Rolex and Tag Heuer and lots of other things. And she is also a part, she has these major sponsors. It aired on major TV networks. All of the opens are very accessible. She's also a multicultural, biracial, multinational brand. And part of the reason I actually have, if you're interested, when I give you the QR code, I have a couple other papers where I'm talking about Osaka specifically as a brand and why brands are so after her now. To preview that a little bit, she is a Gen Z icon in that she communicates very effectively with Gen Z audiences. She communicates very visually online. She is a activist, which is really popular with Gen Z. And Gen Z tends to be more diverse and open to the world. And so having this multinational biracial star is very appealing to the particular demographics that sponsors are going after now, which is all about Gen Z. So this is part of the reason why we can see her as an athlete that both makes a lot of money and is highly visible. You compare her to Kylian Mbappe around the world or Cristiano Ronaldo, of course, she doesn't have the same kind of star power. So women within this hierarchy aren't necessarily equal with men, but they still exist in a hierarchical structure where we can see certain sports and not see other sports. Nico Montano, to go down to kind of the next level, is in the UFC, but the UFC doesn't put her, or she was in the UFC, they never put her on really big cards. So the big pay-per-view events where, Conor McGregor was headlining, or maybe a Ronda Rousey was headlining, or, whoever, they don't put her there. They put her on the equivalent of ESPN Plus. This is back when they were on Fox. And with this, they also put her in an arena that was much smaller when she did her championship fight. So they also did a lot of footage of her going back to her reservation. As I said earlier, she's Navajo. And they talked about her kind of sort of rags to riches, growing up very poor, growing up on the reservation, her community, her family. They really tried to connect into her difference because, again, there is a sellable value connected to her difference. Even though the Navajo people is a very small demographic community, there's still a slice of the pie for the UFC, but they're not willing to put it at the top and spend the most money on it. But they are willing to spend a certain level of money on it so that we have that level of visibility. So with Kiana Clay, so I put her again in the sort of descending order that I'm going in. She is less visible, but she's also within this system where, because she does motocross and because she is an adaptive snowboarder, she has certain circles And she has sponsors that are connected to her particular sports. If you're a fan of those sports, then you might have seen her. If you snowboard, she has a commercial on Burton's, she's sponsored by Burton Snowboards. And so there may be some level of visibility there, but it's not, if you compare, again to Osaka, or if you compare it to like a major male athlete, then you're not going to see the same level of visibility. So to get back to the women's sports fans, then they have to do a lot of labor to then bring about visibility of certain sports. So a lot of what contemporary sports organizations and sponsors and everything, they do a lot of research on who is engaging with their particular product. And so fans know this, and they actually explicitly will say this. Fans of women's sports labor to elevate female athletes for themselves and for other fans and potential audiences. And they presume this labor is necessary because otherwise mass media gatekeepers will maintain the status quo of ignoring women's sports. They perceive it as their responsibility as consumers to advocate for themselves and the sports they love through commodity activism. Women's sports supporters believe that if they make enough noise, sponsors will notice, and if sponsors notice, the remainder of the sports media complex will follow. So fans of major women's sports leagues are online and scale to social media and digital platforms out of necessity. Tumblr and Twitter are important places to find information about women's professional soccer, for example. Journalist Nicole Westman summarizes, without mainstream attention, NWSL fans and supporters have turned to social media platforms like Tumblr and Twitter to build their own coverage and push for the type of recognition and attention they know the league needs. Soccer journalist Meg Lennon agrees that she actually, if she needs to know some information about women's soccer, she instantly goes to Twitter and asks, because that's the easiest way to get the information that she needs. And since the founding of the NWSA and the WNBA, fans have promoted women's sports leagues to make up for the lack of exposure. Mark Andreevich argues that in his study of fan forums that fans are, quote, increasingly encouraged to make the investment of time and energy it takes to be an interactive consumer who can take on the duty of making television more interesting, entertaining, and intelligent. And so Christina Boos calls this a industry fan model. And so we know this of contemporary fan labor across various types of media platforms is that broader industries really want to encourage that labor. It's really useful for them because they can basically get free press for the content that they're producing. So Jenkins, Ford, and Green and Spreadable Media say that an emerging hybrid form of circulation where there's a mix, we're witnessing this hybrid form of circulation, where there's a mix of top-down and bottom-up forces determine how material is shared across cultures, and it's far more participatory. So a lot of, if you go to, like, for example, I just went to a U.S. women's national team game in Austin, Texas. That's where I'm from. And we don't have an NWSL women's soccer team there, but there was a group of people there selling merchandise for the Austin NWSL team that does not exist yet. It doesn't even have rumors of actually existing. There's no investors, but there's all of these fans that are making merchandise and promoting at women's soccer events to try to get someone to invest in a team in Austin. So fans do this a lot, and they do this labor as a labor of love, because they do it for free because they're so invested in it. And then a lot of times the leagues and then the sponsors, like over time, are benefiting from this labor of love. Mel Stanfield calls this love war, specifically in thinking about fandom. So networks and streaming platforms benefit from this, and they don't necessarily have to do the same promotional work as men's sports. So an important distinction here is men's sports are usually seen as an investment. Women's sports are seen as a social justice cause. So what happens then when the economy takes a downturn? Are you more likely to do the social justice cause that seems risky, or are you more likely to do the investment? And so there's like a fundamental, issue with treating sports as just or treating women's sports in particular as just this form of commodity activism. So the NWSL, interestingly, I parallel this a little bit in this piece about something that happened with the UFC in the 90s. We called it the Dark Ages because nobody would put the UFC on TV because everybody thought it was too violent. So fan bloggers would recount the events and circulate the content. And the UFC has explicitly said this is part of the reason we were able to stay alive, because it was these bloggers that kind of kept the sport alive. We see similar things happening here in that there was a women's professional league prior to the NWSL called the WPS. It ran from 2009 to 2012. And like the fans of the UFC from the 90s, they did a lot of work to keep the interest alive, and it gave the NWSL a platform to stand on. So this labor of fans in women's sports is a circulation of content about sports and mainstream, even if mainstream media is not necessarily paying attention to this. As Kim Topoletti, Ann Peguerero, and Gina Como note, female fans in particular deploy user-generated content to bypass both mainstream marginalization and online fan spaces that are male-dominated to allow for alternative expressions and practices of fandom. Just like the UFC's Dark Ages, they circulate this content rather than, and this content is not necessarily aimed at large segments of the population, rather it's seeking smaller demographics. Women's professional soccer might have remained in obscurity without the ability to form these fan networks online and share that information around matches. So another thing that's happening with this is there's this idea of commodity activism. So it's commodity activism is buying or not, at its fundamental level, is buying or not buying things because the mission of the brand is something you want to support. So that's what it is at the fundamental level. And according to the Athletics 2020 fan survey, 67% of NWSL fans agreed that they would seek out products from NWSL sponsors. So many of these sponsors have incorporated issues like fair pay and gender equity into their brand. So Secret is one of those that has explicitly said, we want to support NWSL because we want to support women's rights. In a press release about their partnership, Secret's associate brand director says, we have been vocal in our support of women in sports and dedicated to helping them receive equal visibility. Our goal with this effort is to celebrate the excellence of this league and continue to ensure that female athletes have a platform to play and get the attention they deserve. And a sports journalist followed up in this article and talking about this, and she said, media companies won't change on their own, but it's possible to make them change. So in her assessment, the onus and responsibility for change falls upon fans and supporters. Commodity activism assumes that the collective powers of viewing, of purchasing, and making noise on Twitter is a powerful advocate for change. She says, this is the journalist again, if y'all, the readers, listeners, and viewers are willing to get very loud about it, organized pressure on companies works. Sorry, I'm just gonna check my time. Whew. So the sports organizations, brands, and fans of women's sports form an alliance around shared values to promote gender equity, pay equity, and racial justice. The fan labor involved in promoting their favorite sports and giving away that labor, and the commodity activism around purchasing associated brands all fuels a sentiment of partnership with leagues, teams, and brands in the quest for visibility and pay equity. Positioning fan labor as part of a great cause provides continual justification for the work that understands women's sports as beyond a simple entertainment commodity like men's sports, and views such activism as integral to the ways that the hierarchies of visibilities operate in network sports media. There's an effective force yearning for visibility that is attached to the sharing of tweets or the buying of deodorant, which are both fan behaviors that lead to revenue for sponsors, leagues, and networks to work to elevate women's sports within the hierarchies of visibility. So I'll sum up this particular paper before moving on and talking about where I'm thinking about the book going. So it remains that money, power, and cultural cachet revolve around men's sports to bring them to the highest level of visibility globally. And gatekeepers continue to keep women marginalized from that system. So just because I'm thinking about it in this hierarchical structure, it doesn't mean that the research out there, particularly social science research, that's like women's sports is underrepresented or sexism exists in this sport over here. All of those things are true. But I also think that we have to start shifting the conversation to not just focus on where women aren't, and instead go to where women are. We must expand our focus to consider network media within specific contexts and the economic, political, and cultural imperatives that create the visibility of sportswomen that sometimes operate differently than channels for men's sports. As Kuki and Antonovic argue, we must tell stories differently. And a great example that they give on their paper that I quoted that from is they're talking about how during the sort of pulse around Black Lives Matter and all the sports activism, like Colin Kaepernick, everything that came out of that, the WNBA was regularly, and before Kaepernick ever took a knee, was doing a lot of activism around Black Lives Matter and racial justice and against police brutality. And they had like a huge outcome in the Georgia elections. So they were doing a lot of this work. But mainstream sports, and people kept talking about it, how, that their work is invisible. We're not, ESPN isn't talking about it. Sports Illustrated isn't talking about it. Kuki and Antonovic go, you know who was talking about it? Teen Vogue. Teen Vogue was producing a lot of really great content about what they were doing. And we don't typically think about that as sports media. We think about that as something else. That's a women's genre that's outside of what we think about sports. And so it is actually quite visible, depending on where you look. If we fail to examine the contextual specificities of women's sports, we run the risk of reifying male-dominated media by confining to focus our research on the ways that women are left out. Women's sports is monetized to varying degrees according to market logics that determine A, who is a valuable athlete commodity, B, which demographics those athletes attract, and how valued those demographics are. Much of women's sports is framed as a social justice cause that supports women's rights. The visibility of women's sports is currently framed as the responsibility of the fans to show media powerhouses that they want more access to women's sports. All the while, the multi-billion-dollar enterprise of network sports media benefits from this labor without having to invest in the same level of promotion and take the same level of investment risk that they automatically give for the popular men's sports. All right, so let's talk about how this fits into where I think the book is going. So this was a one-off article. I was working through ideas, wanted to see where I could go with it. And I think back to where I originally got this idea for this paper from. It was a personal experience that I had watching the 2011 Women's World Cup. And in that, there was a match, I think it was like a semifinal match between the US and Brazil. US was down a point, and it was near the end of the match. And Megan Rapinoe crossed the ball to Abby Wambach, who headed it into the net. It went to overtime, and it eventually went to penalty shootouts, and the US won. It was like a remarkable sports moment. And I hadn't really been watching soccer that much until I had watched the Women's World Cup. And I was like, great, okay, they're in this league. Both of these players who now I really like, and there are other players that I wanted to follow. Both of these players are in the Women's Professional Soccer League. So I'll start following them. I'll find them. And so it required a lot of work compared to what I'm talking about now, even. It required a lot of work because they weren't it was not broadcast, it was not streamed. So they played for, when they came back from the World Cup, both Rapinoe and Wambach played for Magic Jack, which was a team in Florida, really shady team. But Wambach was actually one of the assistant coaches while she was also playing. So again, little investment in women's sports, they can't even invest in having a player not be a coach. But interestingly, I was like, well, it's really hard to like access their matches. And I started following Twitter accounts and I started following Tumblr accounts that would produce content about these matches. And I suddenly had a Twitter feed and just a general amount of information that put women's sports into my face all the time, put this team, these athletes, I had access to them. And because of the labor that a lot of fans were doing to get this content out there. And I think that now, like comparing it now, because I think I could stream a couple of the matches, they were really poor streams. And if you compare it now, you can see that there's progress, but I think that progress goes back to the labor that was happening here. And so there's a few different ways I want to think about this and kind of expand out. So take what I did today and expand out in a few different directions for what I want to look at. And you'll see the relationship to what I talked about today. So I want to think about it historically. The story of fan and athlete labor. I didn't talk about athlete labor, but they do a lot to promote their own sports and get the word out there as well. As professional leagues were established and grew. So I'm mainly thinking, I talked a lot about the NWSL today and women's national team, because I know that I'm more familiar with that now, but I'm also thinking of tracking the WNBA. And then also, because I think about this hierarchically, is thinking about other sports that might be a little bit more obscure. Like one I'm really fascinated with is derby, which is a women's, like roller derby began with women. It's predominantly played by women and non-binary folks. So I think it's a really interesting case, and there is media content. They don't always live stream their matches, but Facebook, allows you, or Instagram will allow you to live stream now. So there's way that content gets out there. So I'm thinking about it from like these fan community levels, and how that actually then gets taken up in corporate discourse in various levels. Digital networks, how content about women's sports circulates on various and across various platforms. So I've given you a few examples today, but I think there's a lot of other ways, a lot of other directions I could go with that in terms of thinking about it. So it's networked, it has a history of fan labor, athlete labor, and then also I want to look at what the industry is actually doing. There's a kind of a sports marketing / research group that does work. It's called Sports Innovation Lab, and they've done a lot of work around trying to identify who the women's sports fan is, to try to and actually pitch that to sponsors as a different type of fan than for men's sports, so that it's not necessarily treated as a social justice cause, but it's treated as something that sort of this mainstream capitalist sports industry, like put it in language that the mainstream capitalist sports enterprise can understand. And so ultimately, what I'm trying to do is tell a story that's shifting what's counting as sports media, looking in different places, pushing against this narrative that women's sports is invisible, and instead providing more analysis of how women's sports actually does fit into our media system, and in very specific ways. I'm also interested, and I'm not sure this is going into the book or it's going to be a separate thing, but I'm also interested in college athletes. And now that college athletes have access to name, image, and likeness rights, they have ability to work online in addition to the work that they already do as college athletes, which is, if you're a college athlete, you're pretty busy. And so to actually have to do more work, which most of NIL rights are, 2/3 of it, I think, are on social media. So they have to generate their own content, which is labor, right? So they have the opportunity to do a second job on top of their first job, which I think is, problematic, obviously. So that is all I have for you. I talked a lot at you, but I did get it in the amount of time that we had, so luckily. This is the QR code that has research in it, so it has my publications and also has some works in progress. And so the paper that I presented today is in the works in progress section, so you can read that if you're interested. But I am happy to take any and all questions that you have. I mean, yes.
Okay, so when you're talking about the social justice and men's investment and all that, we have two volleyball leagues being created around the exact same timeline. So professional volleyball league, something that hasn't been in the States ever. And then you're having these celebrities now investing in at least one of these leagues.
Mhm.
So what is the motivation to like? Do you see longevity, or is this just gonna die out because it's kind of a fad? Like, how are these leagues gonna be successful?
You're talking about specifically with the volleyball leagues, like how, like
Yeah,
trying to make it professionalized?
right, so LOVB and then Pro League Volleyball, I think Pro League will be 2024.
Yeah.
LOVB is like in 2 more years.
Well, I think I don't know a lot specifically about volleyball, so I can't speak to the, specificity of that. But I would say, there's a lot of risk in investing in any new sport,
Right.
because if you look at the UFC, for example, which is an example that I know really well, they floundered and they almost went under multiple times before they were actually able to make it into the more mainstream. And it took a lot of experimentation to see what would work, like what type of sponsorship would work, what type of airing would work. One of the big reasons that they were actually, and Jason and I were talking about this today, is one of the big reasons that they were able to succeed was they did a reality TV show that got people access to the fighters. And we were talking about how a lot of like the newer sports would benefit probably from having, something like that, because you get exposure to the athletes, which oftentimes those personalities help carry the sport. And that's a huge problem with the quality of production value of women's sports, is we don't do that type of like background content unless it's the Olympics. We do a lot of that for the Olympics. But if you think about the Women's World Cup versus the Men's World Cup, they don't do a lot of that type of, going to the athlete's hometown and like doing that survey of them. So I think there's a way that if it's a sport that's not as popular, you need like an avenue that people are familiar with to kind of bring them in as fans. And for the UFC in particular, it was reality TV, and we were talking about how it'd be great to do that for, some of the NWSL teams, because that would be it's a way to kind of draw attraction to them. Other questions?
Touch on for a second, but I was gonna ask, how do the Olympics, first of all, thank you, so fascinating and great. But how do the Olympics, kind of putting sports and a little bit more equality in sports on an international platform, kind of contribute or diverge from that hierarchy?
Yeah, like Olympics are fascinating because it's a space where women actually in prime time get more exposure in the United States than men do. And there's a key reason for this, is that women win more. And we really like it when we combine our national identity and our nationalism with something like sports. We are ready and willing to get behind it. But what's interesting is that, that comes around like every 4 years for those specific sports, or every 2 years, if you're doing a lot of different sports. But what we see is there's a huge drop off in, like, we'll watch them during the Olympics, but we don't watch them the rest of the time, because the Olympics is this whole big spectacle. And it kind of goes back to the previous question, that part of the reason that we get invested in the Olympics is because of all the background media that goes into telling the stories about, the trials of these athletes, their, personal experiences that they have growing up. Like it's very, like, it humanizes people, and that broader narrative makes it more than sports for audiences that, because there's a lot of people that watch the Olympics that don't watch other sports either. So, but it has to do more, I think, with its spectacle, it's the nationalism that makes it so popular. There's a hand, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this. It's really interesting. And I like this idea of the hierarchies of visibility, and I'm curious if you have a sense of how do players of these sports, and I guess to some extent fans as well, understand their own role in that hierarchy. I gotta imagine if you are at a lower tier of visibility, you're not oblivious to that fact.
Oh, yeah,
well aware of it. So I'm curious, how are people understanding that? Are they aiming for the top, or is it like, oh, maybe we want to get a little bit better? So just like, how do people understand themselves in that hierarchy?
Yeah, so I haven't, so I've interviewed UFC athletes for the previous book, and we talked about things around that. And I want to do for the next book, I want to talk to more people to have more, a more concrete answer. But I will say that based on those interviews, and then based on some of the stuff that I've read too, in terms of like interviews with athletes and things like that, I would say, just like the rest of people vying for attention on social media platforms, like wanting to be influencers or wanting to have more visibility for whatever reason, they understand how the system works, right? And so they know that certain things sell also. Like when I talked to the UFC fighters, they were like, okay, we know sex sells. And some of them were okay, like, posing provocatively in order to increase their likes and engagement. Some of them were really uncomfortable with that, and some of them kind of went in towards the middle. And so I think people are very aware of the type of content that gets exposure. There's also, racialized dynamics where we know that on social media, if we look at, collegiate athletes who are getting NIL deals, that is skewing very heavily towards white women. So there's also this awareness. If you talk to athletes, they generally know how that works. And they're trying to negotiate as best they can in that system. And some of them are really striving for higher levels of visibility because they know it corresponds with sponsorships. It corresponds with more opportunity. And when you're not getting paid very much, so the case of UFC fighters, or the case of collegiate athletes, who are not getting paid for the sport that they're doing, even though lots of people are making money off of them, they understand that this is an avenue where that they might get more money opportunity, things like that. So I think people are aware and are more or less willing to participate in that system because they know it means, you have to project a particular type of brand, right? And not all of them are willing to do that. And not all of them are capable of doing that because it's, like I said, it's with traditional sports media, it has long been the pretty white sportswoman who was making the most sponsorships, like Maria Sharapova, who maybe, I think played Serena like 18 times, and I don't think she ever won one. She might have won one, but she made more money than Serena did for years and years. And it wasn't until Sharapova was almost retiring that I think Serena even overtook her. This is Serena Williams we're talking about. So there's, within the system of hierarchies, I didn't go into a lot of the sort of racialized and able-bodied and all sorts of, gender identity, like how all those different identities play into the hierarchies. I do more so in the paper, and I will a lot more in the book, because I think that's a big part of where you stand in that. And, of course, like I said, male athletes are more, they can access the top more easily. And then female athletes, it's lower from there. All right.
Thank you so much for this talk. I really appreciate the bigger framing of it around representation. Of course, I'm right there with you and being super frustrated with discourses around representation being some kind of magical cure-all to kind of fix things. But obviously, it's just like there's a lot of things that are misguided about that. And so this is a big idea paper. This is putting forward a big challenge to how we think about visibility by saying mainstream visibility is not what we should be looking at. We should be looking at these other kinds of smaller visibility. I want to push you on that a little bit and ask you think through if I'm understanding what you're saying properly. So I feel like you're saying that that this is putting forward a theory that's looking at specific audiences. So the ones that I could kind of identify are thinking about sports media theorists. Maybe sports media people should be looking at these small audiences or these small venues or platforms. I feel like the industries and the people who hire the athletes should be thinking about small markets as mattering and paying them accordingly, even if it's a small audience. I think that sports fans of those areas should be thinking about their power and how much work they're doing and feel validated and legitimated. But and there might be others that I'm missing. That was one thing. Who is the audience for that you're actually thinking of as being that? so important and valuable that we should be speaking, that we're like actually trying to recognize and validate through this new theory. But I also feel like those are still small audiences, those are still niche audiences, and that idea of representation is a theory of activism and social justice. It's thinking about gender justice. So then I wonder, how is that accomplishing? Like, is that really able to move gender justice forward? Because like, you also know that when you look at a room like us, that we were like, we don't know these people, we don't know these, we don't pay for these platforms, we don't, like, it's not reaching a large audience. And I think that's like, that's kind of the idea behind representation matters being big and mainstream, is that
Right.
it's to reach a lot of people, because that's how like ideology changes, like how we overturn hegemonic ideologies. So then I wonder like where the theory of change comes from, if we're saying that like small representation or like small niche media or small sports or all those things, if that counts and that's what we're looking at, then how does it contribute to a larger idea of gender justice?
Oh, Lori, that's a fantastic question. And I'm gonna have to chew on it for a while. I think that I started out this paper and thinking about trying to figure out what was happening. Like, how is the system structured? And what I'm still trying to figure out, and what I'm hoping where the book can intervene, is thinking about what do we do with that? For the big so what? I think that, you know, we always want to be able to, and, you know, like you, I think the broader social justice issues, you know, are ultimately where we want to move society overall. And I think that for me, the process of redefining a little bit what matters and what we should be looking at is a part of that process. I don't know if at this point I can really articulate what are the steps and like where does that go once we have that awareness of like, okay, this is how the system works, this is how people are sorted in this system, how do we get around that, and what does that mean for gender justice? Because I think that it is incremental in terms of giving more people access to things that we haven't necessarily paid attention to. And yeah, I'm gonna write down your question, and I think it's really beautifully
question. We can think about it together.
I know. I mean, it's such a beautiful question, and it is where I would ultimately, and the other problem that I have with my own paper that relates to this is, so am I saying that we should pay attention to all these, like, you know, little niche markets because they are valuable, and I'm explaining how they're valuable to a capitalist system? Is that the system we really want in the first place? Do I want to import, like, I constantly have this struggle with, like, do I want to incorporate women's sports into this hyper-capitalist system that's exploiting people? And that fundamentally, I don't know how to do that. And that's what the last book really does critique, is that, you know, okay, we have representation, but it enables exploitation. So is that really what I want for women's sports? But then also at the same time, I have this, like, you know, I go back the other way and I'm like, well, is that what we really want for women's sports? But also we don't have an alternative system. So if we want women's sports to thrive within this system, then there's certain rules that we have to play by. And so I constantly have that push and pull between, like, what do I actually want? Because I don't want women to be more exploited in this system. But, you know, what does that mean? So,
Yeah, well, that one keeps every media studies theorist up in.
And what do we want? And, you know, when we like identify these things and say, okay, this is what's happening, and this is ideologically how it's working, and this is way, you know, certain people are disadvantaged and certain people are not, you know. I think we're pushing ourselves, and we're constantly being pushed by the outside. Like, I think we're really good at identifying how hegemony is working, but thinking how outside of it, what the different world might be in our own, like, little niche objects of study. that's a challenge, right? Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for this. As you were talking through sort of the labor that female athletes specifically have to perform online and digitally to sort of maintain their own brands or like bring attention to their sport. Obviously, like the first thing I thought about was micro celebrity and sort of
Yeah.
the institution of like influencers
Yeah.
and that sort of culture. Which was like an institution that like was really developed by women, you know,
Yeah,
in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
And so I'm just like curious, broadly speaking, and this is like kind of outside the realm of sport, but like, how do you see like female athlete micro celebrities, which it kind of sounds like that's what's a lot of it's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
Compared to sort of like quote unquote normal micro celebrity. Like the first thing I think of is like you have a performance on the field and like a performance online versus you're just selling yourself online. But I'm just curious like about the differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's functioning the exact same way. And, the same sort of logics and pressures, like the way brands approach them are happening the same way. Like you get DMs and like said, hey, do you want to be an influencer for this particular product? And the way it works is that there are different tiers, because even sponsors that are not big name brands, they might pay influencers or they might just give influencers free stuff. And so that structure is going the same way. And if you look at collegiate athletes and NIL, it's the same industry logics that are used. And micro influencing is very cheap for companies. And that's why they gravitate towards it. And that's why it's such big business, is that it's a lot easier, if you want to pay, a big name movie star to rep your brand, you're going to spend a lot more money than if you get like a handful of micro influencers. That handful adds up over time. And the reason that it's so lucrative is it's really easy to analyze. It's really easy to take that. And then there's a lot of programs like you can just go online, like as whoever and put a profile into an algorithm that will then spit back like what their engagement rate is, what their followers are, like all of those things. And so I think it's a very easy system. And female athletes get mapped into that, and they get like the Nielsen sports thing that I was talking about earlier. I found it really and this was from a couple of years ago, and I thought it was really interesting that Rose Lavelle came up as more valuable than somebody like Simone Biles. There's obviously racial dynamics that are happening there too, but Simone Biles is much more well known than Rose Lavelle, and Rose Lavelle plays for the NWSL. And so, but if you think about the culture of Instagram, which was primarily what they were looking at, and you think the culture of who the fitness influencers are on Instagram, then having like a young white woman, it fits in with that whole culture and the demographic there. So I think it maps on really well. And you could look at fitness influencers, you could look at athletes, you could look at, a lot of other people that are micro celebrities on platforms.
So then you have stuff also that's like the Big Ten contract, the TV contract, right? So if you're expanding the amount of sports that are getting representation because Fox and the Big Ten and all these other companies are saying, I'm going to invest in college sports.
Yeah.
How does that change the market if now you're kind of having more representation of sport, not just necessarily gender? Like, yeah, probably, we know primarily that money's gonna be going towards broadcasting football games, but there's other opportunities for more sports to get visibility, and then that fan base can follow for years. Like, you keep mentioning Roosevelt, like she's a Badger, so like her fan base started here, and she got famous because her dog what? I don't know if her dog's still alive, but the best pit bull or bulldog in the world, and like that was how she got her comedy or her like good at her social media was she loved Wilma, her dog. So anyway, but like, how do you see that changing now with these bigger contracts going to college, and especially if we have like 3 conferences at one point in our lives or whatever, and it's all this money's going into more amateur sport?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a great answer for it. I think it's fascinating, and I think it mirrors broader media industry trends around diversifying content. Because I think the industries understand that there's value at various levels, and you have to get in and find your market and your niche. maybe it isn't like the biggest names, maybe it isn't like the most marquee, sports, but there's an audience. And like the more you can spit out content that is diversified, the more chance you are to like bring in audiences that you might not otherwise. Another example I have is, so I train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and in Jiu-Jitsu, you never see Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu matches on any like major streaming platform, any sports platforms. There's actually a very specific platform called Flow Grappling. So if you want to watch major Jiu-Jitsu matches, you have to go onto that platform. And so, there's a whole community around that. And the people that I know that do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu will talk about matches that they saw, like we'll go to the gym and we'll talk about matches that we saw on Flow Grappling. And so, 10 years ago, this was not a thing. Like you didn't have access to that. It has to do with like the movement of technology and how we've gone from, as a society, we no longer think of content as needing to access a mainstream, like boiled down to the lowest common denominator audience. Instead, it's like finding the market, finding the taste profiles that actually can make up those different audiences. That's awesome.
Jen, can I, first of all, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
We have kind of two discrete audiences. We have one group, I know we have a number of you who need to leave now, and I'm part of that group. We have another function. I know some of you are budgeted to be here for a little longer, so if we could first collectively give Jen a great hand for your. Some of our students have to get going, so if you feel free to, then if you're up for, are you up for lingering for another?
I can take a couple more.
Anyone who has to go, and I'm among that, feel free to. Thank you again for your great work, and everyone else. We have another great attendance. Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, what was your question? Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it was like, in the vein, I think of a couple where it's like, what's sort of like undergirding or structuring this hierarchy, but maybe also like Lori's question on scale a bit and like what matters, in these scales. But I would talk about the importance of liveness as part of this, like both in the sense that like sports is one of the few things we have in American television left that like still gets watched live with any regularity. And that seems to structure like what you're talking about in visibility, right? Like an ABC live primetime spot meaning more than Paramount Plus.
Right.
But I'm wondering how much that matters as like the industry itself seems to prioritize its streaming services more and more.
Yeah.
And then also the liveness of the events themselves, given so much is fan directed, right? Like if the women's soccer league can get huge crowds and sell a lot of merch at their live events, like how much does getting TV rights matter? I'm sure the licensing deal still is like nothing to sneeze at if you're going to ESPN2 or whatever, but like, and sort of like fan labor compensate in that way too.
Yeah, I mean, I think liveness is, your point is spot on. Liveness is really important in sports because, watching the replay or watching like clips or, just getting the stats afterwards, it's not the same. Like people want to watch it live a lot of times. And so I think it does matter, and it is still kind of the ability to do that as opposed to having like those other things is definitely still valued over everything else. But I think it was interesting because like Claire was talking about last night, we were at dinner and they were talking about this at powerlifting and how the media around powerlifting is a lot of like short videos of particular lifts, and that's part of like the media experience because you can see it. So that there's ways that different sports are also maybe I don't know, maybe the experience of watching it live is way better. I don't know because I don't really watch powerlifting. But I think that there's certain structures of sports that might lend itself more to liveness than others, and where it, because I think with that sport in particular, you know, watching the replay and like critiquing the lift, like maybe you want to see it, you know, like if you're watching like a major, like an Olympic competition or something like that, maybe you want to see it. But I think that it might be different for in different sporting contexts, because we usually, most of the sports that we tend to think about often are the team sports, which tend to lend themselves more towards the liveness aspect, and combat sports, liveness, a lot of sports, but I don't know if it's every sport. And so I think that there's a whole economy of these other sports that are like, don't have like the mainstream visibility at all, like Derby. When I was talking about that, there's like, they never have a Derby. I don't think they have one ESPN ever or any of these other things. So I think that there's different ways that these platforms can engage different sports that are formatted differently.
I'm wondering if, you know, thinking about like the micro influencers and that kind of thing, and the leagues and the need for the leagues to get exposure, if there has been or there will be potentially a shift towards, you know, if you have two athletes who are relatively equal skill level and one has a major platform and the other doesn't, if that's going to start influencing like who leagues decide to draft or bring in, because then more exposure from this athlete means more exposure for the league, more media coverage for the league, and especially for these smaller leagues and women's leagues that aren't getting exposure.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think that the UFC definitely functions like that. It is a who is going to bring in the eyeballs. That's because there are a lot of good fighters out there, but they're not necessarily the ones getting fights. So it's very much a cult of personality. And if you can drum up business on your social media platforms, then the UFC is more likely to book a fight. So I think that I haven't noticed it in, I mean, wrestling functions the same way too. I don't know if I've noticed it necessarily in other sports, but if you think about it as the way that branding is becoming everything and everything has to be marketable, I think it's a logical step that I could perceive teams taking. I just don't know if I've seen outside of those specific examples where they definitely explicitly are doing that. But there's more performative aspects to that. Like you have to build up like intrigue for a fight by pretending that you hate the other person and then hug it out at the end after the match is over. It's like it's very reality TV in that way. And it's like you have to like encourage the fighting, like the interpersonal fighting, in order for it to get marketed. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested to know if anybody else had seen that in other sports. I haven't. But those two, like wrestling and UFC, definitely function that way.
Thanks so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I want to ask you about fan labor. So I really appreciated throughout the talk and your response to Lori, your concern for like the idea of the exploitation of the labor that sportsmen are doing. So when you extend the idea of labor to fans, are you concerned about them being exploited and taken advantage of, or does labor mean something?
Yeah, so I don't think that the exploitation is necessarily functioning in the same way. What I'm concerned about is how it connects back to the industry. Because the industry is like, you need to prove that women's sports are viable, and they rely on the fan labor to do that, whereas they tend to be more ready and willing to invest in men's sports. And so what I see it as more of an issue of like equity in how they approach the business of it that relies on the fans to do that. So it's not that I think that I'm thinking about the individual exploitation of the fan doing that labor in the same sort of way, but it's how like as a system, it's treated differently. And they're basically relying on the labor of people doing that sort of participatory promotion, which I have a problem with more structurally than I do thinking about, because, you know, of course you talk to those fans and you talk to, you know, fans that we would classify in media studies as like, you know, doing fanfic, and they're like, I don't need to get paid. It's a gift economy. I don't need to be paid for it. And so there isn't necessarily like that, you know, that I don't have that huge concern yet. Now, part of what I want to do with the book is actually talk to fans about this and see what they think about it. So my initial hypothesis is I don't see it as a huge issue, But I don't know, like, until I get into it more, I might find other things that I hadn't necessarily anticipated. Thank you.
So maybe this will be our final question.
Perfect.
Go, buddy. No, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You're so brilliant.
Well, that's a real problem. No, I was just thinking about like, again, as you think about some of these more niche sports that are starting to become more formal leagues, I just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts about like ones that really have like a well thought out media strategy first, like it almost seemed, you know, so I'm thinking about like CrossFit, for example, where almost putting that at the center of building the league around it, right? Like figuring out what micro media is going to work to build that up into a larger,
Yeah.
like, do you see that with all, like, I guess I'm maybe thinking about like roller derby as the other example of that, which is a very, at least in the cities I've been in where I've seen that, it's, you know, pamphlets, it's a much like a more local advertising
DIY.
strategy way.
Yeah.
And so when you're talking about like, yeah, can we imagine different kinds of relationship between sports and industries? Does that also mean like envisioning a different media infrastructure?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think I would have to do some more digging into some of like the origins of like you know, derby specifically, to see structurally how it's working, to see what might work. With the UFC in particular, they did a ton of experimentation to kind of see what was going to draw. They did all sorts of different media angles, and they jumped on the social media bandwagon really early on when a lot of leagues were like, they wanted their fighters to be tweeting, when a lot of sports leagues were like really afraid of what that was going to mean for their PR. So, and that goes back to your question that you were talking about earlier. Like, I think that there's a level of experimentation that's required to see with those specific niche sports, like what it might take. But with that experimentation, you need investment. And so that's why, you know, certain sports, you know, you don't get that, you know, same level of structural investment. And there's also sports that are just not as tenable for the way we typically think about media. I was talking to some collegiate athletes the other day, and they were talking about how they don't get a lot of images shot of them by the athletics department because they're cross-country runners. And so there's just not as much media, like they just don't send people out to take pictures of people running. And so I think sport obviously is a really broad category. And that's why certain types of media, like the powerlifting example, like certain types of media might fit into different types of media structures in different ways. I don't think there's a one size fits all, especially for, you know, I'm trying to think of like some sports like, well, pickleball is getting to be really popular now. And like that obviously could fit into some of the more conventional structures that we have already, just because of the nature of the sport. I also think one thing I'll say to end is it's interesting too, what happens with women's sports when it's working under the same broadcast rights and it's working under the same sponsorship deals as it is for men's sports. And that goes back to my point about investment, because tennis pay is equal in terms of winnings. It's broadcast, the same broadcast rights. It's not separate. It's not the, you know, women's Australian Open and the men's Australian Open. It's all the deals are negotiated. All the press is happening. The whole structure, like men and women are in the same structure. NBA, WNBA are two separate leagues. MLS, NWSL are two separate leagues, completely different rights, completely. Now, there are some teams that have co-ownerships or have ownerships of NWSL and MLS teams, but, and the same is true like outside the States, but those are structural issues of those sports because those sports operate differently that don't lend themselves to some sort of incorporating women in the same way. UFC is another example because you have a fight card of like what 12 to 15 fights, men's fight, women's fight. men's fight, women's fight, and it's like all the same rights, all the same, you know, and so I think there's a lot to be said and investigated around which sports might gravitate towards different types of media platforms and structures and things like that. So, great question. Thank you all.
Yeah.
So
Thank
wonderful
you.
question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria and Bios, for having us.
Yes.
Of course, no, thank you very much. This is fantastic. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it.
Anybody who's interested, we're gonna retire the set for some curds and some beverages, so. Anybody can find it. Yes,